This is my me discussing my journey in Christianity and why I might be one of the people who think differently because it never really took with me. It never worked. So I'm going to do this thing called connecting the dots, and it's going to be in my life journey, and it's going to be a summary of some of my life journey and how it worked. Um, And I might even have a separate tape focusing on my life journey and how I came to think the way I think, the method and the thoughts. So we're going to focus on the Christianity aspect on this journey. Well, part of it started when I was a little toddler, a little baby, when I was a little bitty thing. I remember my mom telling me to go play by myself. I was barely walking, and what it was that she used to get in the backyard with a blanket and have me out there, and she'd play with me. But on this occasion, she had something else going on she had to do. I think she was working or something, and she said she had to do that instead of play with me. And then I didn't know what to do, so she told me to go play by myself. I looked at her apparently with questions because she explained how to play by myself. She basically told me to go over there and play with my toys by myself. And so that's what I did. And I made up a little story in my mind and proceeded to start playing and enjoying myself as I thought and imagined my little stories and acting, having my little characters acted out that I was playing with my little toys. And by the time she was through doing what she was doing, I didn't really want to be bothered with her. She coming over playing with me. I'm in the middle of something now. So I didn't really want to be bothered, but I stopped and played with her anyway because she was ready for me. But I never forgot how to think and imagine for myself. Fast forward up to me in elementary school. I was baptized Catholic. Um, my mom's husband, my stepfather, he was Catholic. He was a black man. And he lived in a big city, and she lived in a smaller city. But he was in the military for a while. And what we would do was go to the large city that was his hometown and live with him. And then she get mad at him. We moved back to the small city, which was my mom's hometown. Um, so while this is over about a 3 or 4 year period while they were trying to work on their marriage. So she would be she'd move up there with him for a while and get mad at him and move and leave him and go back to her family's hometown. So what happened was the difference is that the grades at the area, the school grades, the first grade in the big city, they were teaching the stuff that would be in the second grade in the small town. So as I move up to the big city, I would be behind for a little bit, but then I catch up and be on par with the kids in the big city. But then when she leaves them and move to the small city, I would be a grade ahead. So academically, they'd skip me. So around the first grade in the small town, I got skipped to the second grade because I already knew how to do the first grade stuff, and I was on par with the second graders in the small town in this small town Catholic school. But in the second grade in the small town Catholic school, they teach you Bible study. So I'm like 5, 6 years old with 7 and 8 year olds in this Bible study. And essentially, I was one of the ones that essentially got put out of Bible study because I kept asking questions. They didn't know how to answer and couldn't answer me, and I'm trying to apply logic to a situation that ain't making no sense. And I'm gonna come back to that because when I was in Catholic school up in a big city, the teacher used to have kids tell stories, get up in the front of the room and make up a story and tell it to the kids in school while she graded papers. We just thought of it as telling stories. Later years in life, I realized that she was just trying to give us busy work while she graded the little papers. So me and this other boy would be the best storytellers. And so I'm like 5 years old or so in the first grade in the big city school. And so me and him would just be I would take a turn telling the story, and he would too. So we were good storytellers because we knew how to tell a good story. The kids loved our stories. They would vote, ask for us to tell a story more than they did the other ones, and they enjoyed our stories. And we just make it up. Okay. But in order to tell a story, you had to understand a sequence of events that made sense. So, needless to say, me sitting up there in Bible study in Catholic school, and they telling me stuff that don't make sense, where characters come in out of the blue and all of that. We got a problem. So I'm asking, where did they come from? What happens? How did she show up? Where did this? All of that. And then finally, one of the teachers says, she couldn't explain it, not to my satisfaction. I don't know what her answers were because I kept asking questions and they weren't satisfactory answers. But I do remember this. One of the 7-year-olds, little this time, the Catholic school was a white girl. Now, when they were sending me to this Catholic school in a small town, this was a primarily white school, and I'm going to tell you more about that later. But it was a neighborhood school, so I wasn't bused. I went to that school. Um, and that was in the first and second grades. Yes, first, second grade, never third grade. Um, anyway, you have never been chastised until a 7-year old has cocked her head and told her you had to have faith. And I realized, and the teacher confirmed it, everybody around her nodding their head, talking about faith. And I'm going, what the hell is that? That don't make sense. In my head, I'm realizing it's time for me to shut up. So, um, needless to say, I got put back to the first grade because they couldn't really answer me to my satisfaction, but I knew to shut up asking. So I did. I stopped asking, but I never forgot that I had questions. I just stopped asking them out loud. Um, Finally, we moved to the small town for good, and I think I was around the third grade. And this way, I was no longer having to go to the Catholic schools in the big city or the small town. So I'm in public school in the third grade, and this is my journey for beginning with my non-bus public school. Now, this school that I went to, it was on the border between the white side of town and the black side of town. The poor whites were across a particular street on in the town, and the blacks lived over on the other. And only they were separated by a street. So, but the school was close enough for a few of the poor whites kids to come over to it. And so they were there and they were fine. And these were years when things were pretty okay. Um, and that's my journey. That's all I want to say about that part. But in my home life, we were going to Baptist church. And so I finally went to my first Baptist church and was fascinated. People said words I could understand. Uh, they had a choir that I liked because I like me some good music. And they started shouting. The first time I saw somebody shouting, I was dumbfounded. Uh, Everybody in the church was excited, and so nobody could explain what that was and how come y'all ain't taking us somewhere. Because the lady shouting, the man shouting, the another lady then went off, and nobody's going to the hospital, but they do have the ladies in the little white nurses thing having a fan on them and catching them as they faint. So I was sold on Baptist church because there's some stuff going on in there. But I wasn't necessarily going to stay in that Baptist church. So me and my friends around, now this is me around about 14 or so. We went 12, 13, 14. We went all over town to various churches till we found a church home that we liked. Various friends of mine picked out different churches. I picked out one I liked, and I liked the one with the best singing. And that's the one I stayed with. And I stayed with that church till my early 20s. By the time I got to reading really what was in the Bible, I was not liking what I saw, especially with women's issues. But anyway, the next dot I'm going to connect was me in the 10th grade, my first year in high school. I'd already found my church home, but now my next dot is me in 10th grade. The teacher that we had was a new teacher fresh out of college and got his teaching degree. He was about age 24. He was a white man. His student body, our class, was all black students, male and female, all black teenagers. And he came to us and asked us what did we want to learn. It was world history. I think that was the name of the class, world history or world something. And we can learn anywhere on the globe. You name the place, and that's what we'll focus on for this semester. And we picked Africa as a group of students. We picked Africa. So he said, okay, I'll come back. And he went home, prepared a lesson plan, and came back and started teaching about Africa. The first thing he taught us was where Africa was on the map, on the globe. He talked about the equator. This is day one. He showed us where he pulled out a globe that was big enough for all of us to see. He showed where the equator was on the globe and said as you got closer to the equator, you were darker because that's where the sun was. That's where the sun hit the most. So that's where the darkest people are. And he says as you go closer to the poles, to the northern regions, you get lighter because there's less sun. And so, me with my thinking self, I looked at the equator. I looked at where the Europeans were, where the because that's where the light skinned people were. That's where the white people were. So I looked at England and Germany and all of that. I saw where that was and how far that was from the equator. And then I looked at where the equator was. And then I looked at where Bethlehem and Jerusalem and all those places that are in the Bible. And I said to myself, I don't know what color Jesus is, but one thing he ain't, he is not white. So who in the world is this on the fan? Because that's as I'm sitting there in church all the time, I'm looking at we have these church fans with this little blonde haired guy on there, and he's supposed to be Jesus on this fan. I never read the small print that tells the credits of where that picture came from, or if I did read it, it didn't register. Um, so who in the heck is this blonde guy on this painting? Who in the heck is that guy on the crucifix? Who are these people that are blonde haired, light colored eyes folks? Who the heck is this lady with this blonde hair and this halo? That can't be Mary because she wasn't. They don't make people that look like that around Jerusalem. They make like that they have to be some other people because they ain't blonde hair down in Jerusalem. So I was confused. I later went to college and started taking art history and saw even more confusing things. Except now I knew how to look it up. Because with the art history class, you see any painting in any art history book, you can read the history of that painting or that statue. You can read about who the artist was, when the artist was born, and when they died. You can read who the model was and what kind of lifestyle they had, and all of that. It's all right there. All you got to do is look at it. Christian art is plain as day. They're telling you who painted the picture, when it was painted. So even if they're depicting it as some deity, it's not. It's probably the drunk man down the street that the artist drug in there to pose for him. And very likely that's the case. Um, for example, there's this man, Fra Filippo Lippi. He does a lot of Madonna paintings where this bare-breasted woman is nursing the baby, except she's his mistress. She's not the Madonna. She's this mistress. She is a lady that has had sex with him, an ex-nun that he raped, and then turned her into his mistress and model. Some of the males that you see depicted as Jesus are male prostitutes, are males on the fringes of that society, very young boys. They're not 32. These are people who are poor and lived in the fringes because the people who could make another kind of living didn't pose for pictures. Artists weren't rich, nor were the models rich. These are very poor people who were living on the fringes and they made livings off of their bodies. But you can find that out if all you have to do is just read an art history book. Uh, Another one is Leonardo's of Venice's The Last Supper, and among the many of them. These are people, everybody always tells you about the thieves and things that are actually depicted as the apostles on the Last Supper, as well as the person that's depicted as Jesus. These are people on the fringes who lived a hard life and are criminals in many cases. They're not mainstream folk because mainstream folk didn't do that. They did other things. The women that posed as Madonnas in Europe were women who were on the fringes. They were prostitutes and various other kind of things that would do that because nice ladies didn't pose bare breasted for paintings. So they're just, the ones who had to pose, had to. Because they didn't have no other way, they probably were uh, uh, um, dating the artist most likely in a prostitute for him. Those Charles Dickens books and things like that about people starving in the street in Europe, they're true. They have clear history. Like the Little Match Girl story and the uh, uh, um, what's the one with the three ghosts? That one. All those stories, those weren't that far from the truth. That was their lifestyle. They had a very harsh lifestyle. So if you can't make some kind of money to buy yourself some food, you might starve to death easily, easily. So um, that's how I learned how to research about the paintings and the art characters in the biblical books and things. Um, One of the best paintings, and not to take away from the art is beautiful, but they're white people who depicted other white people as religious figures. Um, like Michelangelo's the Sistine Chapel, as he's got this bearded man being God and this other man being Adam, and they're touching fingers. That's actually Michelangelo's father and his son. That is not God. That is not Adam. Those are people that he knew that he got to pose for him. Okay? So get that, please get that through your head that those are not religious icons. And if you are going to have a church, then the kids ought to have a weekly presentation depicting a description of the truth of behind a painting in each Bible. Page one, like page 85 has a painting of such and such. That child ought to tell that artist's history, a brief artist history, and a brief history of the models, so that y'all can get that through your head that it's not God and it's not Jesus and it's not Mary and it's not anybody else from the Bible, because they just not there. Those are white people painting other white people, and they have every right to do that. You and I and other black people need to stop worshiping them as that. Okay, because it's not that. These are people who are on the fringes of that society. Other models for artists are when a patron or somebody who's buying a painting tells the artist that I want to be depicted as so and so. That's what the artist does. So sometimes you want to be depicted as Zeus or God or some other saint, and that's who he gets depicted as because he paid for the painting, or he paid for the stained glass window, or he paid some money on the church. These are patrons. That's what they did. So set that aside. But it took me years before I got to that point and figured it out. But my journey started with me in the 10th grade trying to figure out who the guy was on my fan. And I did. I found out. And it's just a guy on the fan that posed for artists. No, no knock against anybody. Our problem is that we still think that those people are actual deities, and they're not. They're just people. Okay, that's the end of that part of the journey. Um, a good reference book, if you want to start on your part of the journey, would be a history buff from a long time ago called J.A. Rogers. He wrote some great books about people and his travels and stuff and what he learned. And I looked up his references and they're true. Um, for example, I don't want nobody talking about anything religious unless they can tell me some primary sources. A primary source is a source, a reference, like a book that was written or translated writing from somebody who was alive at the time it happened. A primary source will be like you see a shooting star, right? You saw it with your own eyes, and then somebody comes and asks you about it. You're the primary source because you saw it yourself. Okay? Now, the person that asks you about it, if they repeat your story, they're not a primary source, they are a secondary source. If somebody else repeats that story from a third person, then that's a tertiary source. They're not primary sources. Only the one that saw it with their own eyes is a primary source. Now, if you take and wrote that story down, that what you saw, then what you wrote is a primary source. Somebody who read what you wrote and decided to quote something out of that is not a primary source. They are a secondary source. So, what I'm saying is get books that you want to read about religion are from people who were there at the time, who wrote it, who looked at it. I read books from about the 300s. That is 300, not 1500, not 1400, 300. I asked my religious teacher about it because it was a translation um, of the from Greek or some other language. And what I was reading was a translation of it from the 300s. And I said, is that still a primary source if it's a translation? And he said, yes. So I'm going to call that a primary source because he's a religious history teacher and I'm good with it. So, excuse me, read the primary source. Oh, excuse me, I'm going to pause it. Now, I'm back. What you'll find if you do look at primary sources is that you'll find some of the early Christian leaders were black people. This Christianity was a inherited religion for white people. It was started off pretty black. These are the 1 and 200s. That is about 50 years after Jesus was had passed away or was killed. 300 years after Jesus was killed, and immediately following. These were your primary sources. Read those because a lot of those books about black people, a lot of those depictions about black people, it wasn't a white person's religion until much later. So that's food for thought. That's I'm gonna end right here on that part, and then I'm gonna pick up with origins and Christian religion. The only thing I discussed here was my journey and all of the questions I asked and how I found my answers. And now the next part would be me focusing on how we got here today. All right.